Okay, let's see if we can wrap this up with this video, wrap up this chapter with this video. Okay, it says I use several worksheets and charts to analyze what's going on with the sales of my books. So he has several worksheets. For an analysis that looks at the data over time, and I just showed you what a pivot table looks like over time, we collapse the data. A pivot table and pivot chart is nearly a perfect solution. It collapses the hourly figures that I get from my web queries into more manageable time slices. I find that summarizing by day, not by month, strikes a good balance between the overwhelming amount of data in an hourly analysis. It's too much data, right? If you get it every hour, I guess. And the lack of detail in the monthly or even weekly analysis. So he wants to look at the daily analysis. Well, of course that's very simple using the pivot table, but as we said, we have this one issue, and that is that if you add new data, you have to update the pivot table every time, and he doesn't want that. Of course, when your baseline extends over several hundred days, it's time to start thinking about weeks or months as your new. So he says if you have a really big data set, maybe you have to do it in weeks instead of days. But whatever. Figure 110 shows the pivot tables that I rely on to synthesize the data on sales. So it's basically what I just showed you. He's using average and average, right? We talked about average. This is the average ranking over the day, average ranking over the day, average ranking over the day, and so on. Right? So this is what we just saw in the last video. As powerful as pivot tables are, and I believe that pivot tables are the most powerful and flexible tool for data synthesis and analysis available in Excel, they can't tell when you have changed the underlying data. In other words, when we keep adding new data, or even if even if we don't add new data, if the current data somehow changed, the pivot table won't automatically update. And without help, they can't tell that their underlying data range has added another row. In contrast, something as simple as the sum function can update itself. So, yeah, I think I showed you that before. So, if you change the number in one of the numbers that's being summed, then the sum will change automatically, so it can update itself. And when the underlying values change, if you have entered this formula in some cell, the value that it returns changes immediately if you change any of the values in the range A1 through A5. That's not true of a pivot table that's based on those cells or any other cell. You have to do something special to refresh the table when the underlying data changes. Okay, so that's the issue we are trying to deal with. But sum won't change its own argument. So if you if you want to include more data later, like A1 to A10, this won't work. I mean, you have to update it. You have to really fix it. If you now put a new value in A6, sum doesn't change itself from A1 to A5 to A1 to A6. Of course not. The way I prefer to handle this is by means of dynamic range names. You might already know that you can assign a name to a worksheet range and then use that name instead of the range address. If you have given, so you can take a set of cells and you can give them a name. So I could call this range, or this set of cells, give it some name, like call it this, for example. Okay? And then instead of doing this, you're also allowed to do this. Okay, so that will work. But that's just a name for a what's the word? For a static range. For a static range, that's, you know, that won't. If I just do it in the normal way, then if I add new data like into A6, it's not going to include that. Add-ins won't include that. So So that's just a kind of static range name. But there is something called dynamic range name. So that's what he wants to tell us about. I show you how to name a range shortly. First, you should know that if you define a range properly, you can get it to change its own dimensions when you add a new row or column to it. Okay? He says, so that's the point. We want it to change its own dimensions. But he does say that tables, which is new in Excel 2007, do that automatically. And you should probably investigate their capability, but he's not going to do tables. Okay. Defining a dynamic range name. So he's going to show us how to do this. Begin by selecting the worksheet that contains the range you want to name. This step is not strictly necessary, but I usually find it helpful. Then follow these steps. Click the Ribbons Formula tab. Click the Define Name button in the Define Names group. The New Name dialog box shown in figure 1.11 appears. So we'll do that in a minute. Enter the name you wish to establish in the name box, so up here. In this case, leave the scope with the default value of workbook. I use the base pivot table on the data in my summary sheet shown in figure 1.7 with the summary sheet's layout shown there. Type the following formula in the refers to here box. Type this and click OK. Okay, so let's try it. Okay, before we finish this though, let's just do a regular name instead of a dynamic name. Just see how that's done so that you see the simple way first. So click the Ribbons Formula tab and then click the Define Name button in the Define Names group. Let's try that. So we go to the Formula group, and then here's Define Names and Define Name. So we get this. So let's just do a simple one, not a dynamic one. So let's just go to, call it, call it, what is this, the 4th? We'll call it May 4. Okay. And so May 4 is going to be not this. I'm just going to be this. Okay, May 4th goes down to there. Okay, so this now is called May 4. Actually, sorry, I'm going to do it this one just to make it a little bit more interesting. I'll call that May 4th. Okay, so click OK. Let me try it that way. Okay. So that's May 4. Now suppose I do this. Equals sum. So I could do it this way. Sum like that and close it. Oh. It automatically put it in there. I didn't want it to do that, but anyway, so you can see that what it does. So May 4 means this range. So if I can put it in like a formula like this, and Excel will understand it. Okay, so it gives you the result. That's the normal way to create a named range. But he's going to do something a little bit different to allow it to sort of when new data is entered at the bottom, it will also include that. So let's check that out. So he says get this thing up again, so I'll do it again. Define name here. And then enter the name you want to. So let's use to establish in the name box. In this case, leave the scope. Okay, so it doesn't give me an example of what name to use, but okay. I'll just call it test name. And by the way, it didn't want a number in the name for some, so you don't put a number in the name. Okay, now enter the name you want in the box. In this case, leave the scope as workbook. I based the pivot table on the data. Okay, so we're going to put in this formula. In here. And now we have to understand what this is. First let me click OK. Okay, now what does it mean? Okay, so let's look at it. Here's a quick explanation of the formula. So remember, what normally would go in here is just a range, right? A range of cells. This is a little bit looks a little bit more complicated than that. The offset function here has, by the way, how many arguments are there for the offset function? Well, how many commas are there? Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So there's all those arguments. There's 5 arguments for this offset function, right? If I go to here and I type in offset, it tells me what these are supposed to be. Okay, in case you want to know some information about the offset function. So it gives you a little hint about what it's supposed to be, but I don't want to leave that there. So I'll just delete that. But there are 5 arguments. Okay, so the offset function returns. What does that mean, returns? It means it gives out a range of cells. So that's what we want, because we put it into that box where it's expecting a range of cells. So that's good that it gives a range of cells that are offset from an anchor cell, meaning that it's a range of cells that's offset from a given cell. So like the anchor cell might be here, and then we say, okay, go over 2 and down 1, and then, select these. So in other words, suppose we're here at A, and we say offset 1, 1. That would mean go over 1 and down 1. Or if we said offset 2, 1, that would mean go over 2 and down 1. So we would start from here. So it's offset from A by 2, 1. 2, 1, is that right? Is it the... It might be 2, 1 might actually be here, here to here. But anyway, that's the idea. So, so offset from here to here is what they're talking about. And the anchor cell would be A. So the offset function returns a range of cells that are offset from an anchor cell. Here the anchor cell is defined as A2. So here's the anchor cell. Now remember, first of all, we write summary exclamation mark A2. What does that mean? That means the summary sheet's A2 cell. And the dollar signs, I'm not sure why they have to be there, but that will mean that when we copy that, it wouldn't get changed, right? We talked about this before. So anyway, better leave it with the dollar signs in there. Okay. Okay, so notice that in figure 1.7, the A2 cell is where the label when is entered. So hopefully mine is also the same. A2 is where the label when is entered. So that's the anchor cell. And more labels follow it in row 2, columns B through I. So there are more in his there are more over here, all the way to I. In ours, there's nothing over here, but at least there's more from here to here. He has more books, right? That's why. We're only doing one book. Okay. I want to include those labels in the defined range because they're needed for the pivot table. So actually we should modify what we did because I don't want to go as far. So, but anyway, let's see what happens. The two zeros that follow here in the offset function tell Excel how many rows and how many columns away from A2 the resulting range should be. So it's a little bit, seems like it's not necessary because he's not going anywhere. He's not going, it's zero, maybe 0 rows and 0 columns, right? So he's really not offsetting anything from A2. So he's actually starting at A2, but you could offset if you change these zeros. In this case, because both values are 0, the resulting range is offset by 0 rows. So this is the rows, and this is the columns. 0 rows and 0 columns. By the way, in almost all programming and all applications, it's always rows are mentioned first and columns second. And that's true here too. This is the row, and this is the column that we're offsetting. Okay. So we're actually going to begin with cell A2. The fourth argument here is the fourth argument is the function count A. Or I'm sorry, it's the function count A with that inside. Summary B. Tells Excel how many rows to include in the offset range. So in other words, we're going to go down from, we're going to go down from when, and we're going to go over here, and we need to say how far down we want to go. Like in my first example, I only went down from here to here, right? So I want to say how far down we're going to go. Now normally I would say, okay, go from, in this case I said what? Go from B3 to B26. That's a static range, but we want a dynamic range. So we're instead of using just a static range, we're going to input this function count A. So what is count A? Count A, if we put in this argument, means count how many elements are in column B, basically. So it means how many non-empty cells are there in column B. Okay? So that's exactly what we want, because we want to go from here all the way down to the end, which is like 5,000 rows down. Okay, so as long as there's something in there, count A will count it, and so it'll tell you how many rows are not empty. And the reason it's count A as opposed to just count is count only counts the numerical ones, so it wouldn't count this first one. Okay, but count A also includes this as part of the count, and he wanted to include this, so he's using count A instead of count. So count only includes the numerical values that are in there, but count A includes the non-numerical as well as the numerical. So count A function tells Excel how to count the number of values in here, column B, on the summary worksheet. So when the VBA code runs and adds a new value in column B, so when we add a new value, when our VBA code runs, the count A function will count an additional value and redefines the number of rows. That's how adding a new row at the bottom of the range causes the definition of the range to increase by 1 row. Okay, so that's how he makes it dynamic. He notes, he says, I use count A instead of count because I want to include the text value in cell B2. Using count would ignore that text value. Count A pays attention to both numeric and alphanumeric values. The final argument to the offset function tells Excel how many columns to include in the result range. So how many columns do you want to include? So that's 3. We want to include 3 columns. Okay? Here I want to include 3 columns, one for the date, one for the stats book ranking, one for the BAXL book rankings. Okay? It's called dynamic range because the dimensions of the range can change depending on the number of records or fields or both that are added or removed from the range. Okay, so this should give us the dynamic range that we want. Okay, finally, using it, okay, we still need a little bit more, and this video is getting too long, so I'll stop it and do one more.